in all the different kinds of work I do, scholarship, newspaper columns, magazine writing, you know, with footnotes and without. The thing I write about most is the cultures of cities, just especially how creative individuals sort of find their way to their art or their craft through the landscape, and how that craft then finds an audience. How, you know, how creativity in whatever form it takes, you know, playing guitar, painting, landscape design, but also say boxing or, you know, playing basketball. How all those creative impulses sort of take shape and find their way to an audience and find their way into the market and find their way to other people. So a lot of things I write about are the histories of those forms are connected to the histories of cities. So like in the case of blues, which I write about a fair amount, sort of the history of folk migration and changes in the nature of work and changes in neighborhoods, and all that affects the music and the way it sounds and who listens to it. And so, you know, you can hear these big movements of people and capital and ideas in the music, or you can see it in the form of the way a punch is thrown in boxing, or you can see it in, you know, between the lines of a novel, or in a movie, in the backdrop, in the setting of a movie. And so what I'm looking for are these big historical changes, big transformations of city life, and the way they show up in art and where they show up in culture. One of the big stories is the post-industrial transformation of cities, and how that shows up not only in work and in the economy, but also in art and culture. That is not only in work, but in play, or in leisure, or in you know, the making of beauty. And so I'm interested in everything from, you know, the landscape, how, you know, a lot of museums and also a lot of other businesses are in old factory buildings, right? Or old factory buildings have been turned into places of display for thinking about culture. But also the way, for instance, the history of a city is remembered, the way work is remembered and memorialized in the city, conflicting and changing ideas of what it means to be successful, or to be a man, or to be a woman, or to be to do good work. All those things are occasions to see the transformation of the city, and that can take the form of everything from, you know, analyzing a scene from a movie, especially now that Massachusetts has this tax credit and all these movies are shot in Massachusetts, right? So analyzing a scene from a movie to see how the kind of deep story or the big story of the transformation of cities might be present in the background of a chase scene or a love scene or something else that doesn't seem to be about that. But it also means looking at, for instance, the cultures of place. And I've written a fair amount about Brockton, for instance, where there's sort of this question of, well, what are we going to do with the industrial history of Brockton? What are we going to do with Rocky Marciano? Are we going to celebrate this? Are we going to tiptoe around it? And, you know, there was a movement to try and replace Rocky Marciano with Thomas Edison, which I thought was a classic post-industrial attempt to say, like, well, you know, maybe we should remember it as a place where Thomas Edison did really important work as opposed to the work Marciano did. And those kind of moments where people think about, you know, what's the form and function of our city? What was it in the past? What is it now? What do we value? Those kind of moments, I think, are of interest to me. And they also run up against something which I think people in the museum and history trade run up against all the time, which is people are less flexible. People are less fungible than money, right? The money can flow out of manufacturing into service fairly easily, but people's ideas about what's important, and people's sense of connection to place, and people's desire to be connected to a place in a kind of thick and lasting way isn't so fungible, right? And people want that connection, and increasingly people go to places where they feel that connection. And I think that's the great advantage of these older former industrial capitals, is you feel like you're somewhere. You know, you're not buttoned up in your car with the windows up and the air conditioning on. You're somewhere in a landscape where you can feel the thickness of the layers of, you know, different versions of what it meant to work, different versions of what it meant to support your family, different immigrant stories and migrant stories. And that's, I think, part of the kind of deep satisfaction of just even the landscape in some of these places that used to be famous for making shoes or textiles or you know, weapons or whatever. I think in a one-to-one way, that's a very difficult argument to make, right? That it's going to be a sort of the literal foundation of an economy where, you know, people are going to flock from all over the world to work in the heritage tourism industry. I think you're not going to make that argument in the same way that it was possible to make it about factories. But, and here I think of something that the manager of the Chicago House of Blues said to me. I said, you know, blues doesn't pay the bills, but blues is the hook for the resale, right? Which is the idea that part of the attraction of the place is this sense of heritage, this sense of deep history. And that attraction can be leveraged, can be parlayed into a different identity for the place that might attract service industries, that might attract industries looking for educated workers, that might attract people who are looking for a way not to spend 3 hours a day in their cars, but want to live a kind of a walking life. And say technology has enabled them to be somewhat flexibly removed from their workplace, so they can live in a small city, which I think has, the small cities have attractions of their own, and New England is very rich in small cities. They live in a small city and lead kind of a walking life, and still do cutting edge work. So yes, you're not going to replace the factory with a tour of the factory in a one-to-one economic way, but that kind of heritage tourism and the idea that these are attractive places, I think, can be the leading edge of a transformation. But if you look around the country, there's not that many cities that have completely passed through that transformation and out the other side. And I would argue that you don't want them to completely pass through that transformation. You want them to have that kind of aura, that kind of sense of history. Take a look at a city like Pittsburgh, which arrived at that crossroads earlier. But part of the appeal of Pittsburgh is, in fact, that industrial legacy, right? I think what we have in New England is, we have Lowell as sort of one extreme pole of what's possible. But then if you factor out the federal involvement and all that, we come back to your question. Is it paying the bills, right? I think that that process is becoming more and more familiar, so that no one is surprised to see artists moving into those lofts. And even the mayors of cities, you would find it unlikely that, for instance, the mayor of Easton, Pennsylvania, would be, we got to get some artists into these lofts, right? And that was sort of the reaction to the emptiness of downtown, or the mayors of, mayor of Brockton or a place like that. That itself is a measure of how normal that process has become, and it's not really received as gentrification. It's received as, the new people are moving in, people with a different set of values and a different set of priorities. But it's not like rich people are moving in and taking away our city from us. It's more like they're using the downtown that was being underused. So I don't see that as, yes, there's naturally conflict or difference, but I don't see that as a struggle over the neighborhood in the way you would in a place like New York City, where it's like, well, people need to be moved out so new people can move in. That's not always the case here. I think it's more the case that, so there's new people moving in who don't have the same ideas about working with your body, and don't care about high school football the same way, and don't observe the same holidays with the same passion, and feel differently about what they do with their hands or with working with their minds. And I think that's just the natural, that's a kind of a natural process that needs to be worked out over time. But we're still talking about the beginnings of this process, not the end result of this process. It's not over, and it's not going to be over anytime soon. Well, Detroit also raises the question of the ecological argument for the creative economy. That is that now there's this other set of arguments for why these cities are attractive. That there's a kind of open territory in the center city that suddenly becomes a place to also experiment with sort of green urbanisms and new urbanisms and other possibilities. I've always found that it's the resonance between what's in the museum and what's outside the museum that really makes that work for me. So it's the trip to the museum and the kind of rigorous presentation of this history, and then the meal you eat in the converted red brick building, and the walk down the street to go see some music that night in a building that used to be a textile mill or whatever. That kind of thickness of experience, I think, matters a lot. That it's not confined to the museum. That the museum is actually creating a kind of explanatory layer for what is this really layered experience, where everywhere you go, you hear resonances and see resonances of that. So that's one thing I would say. And the other one is that there are things about industrialism that it's sort of increasingly esoteric quality makes it appealing. I mean, think about little kids and trains. Trains are right up there with dinosaurs, right? In that they have a kind of limitless presentist appeal for children of a certain age, that they're very historically bounded, but they also occupy this kind of timeless category of fascination. And it's not just children, obviously, all kinds of people. So I think the steam engine really almost falls into that category. So there are things about in industrial urbanism that I think transcend their moment, even though it's interesting to people to understand their moment. And another thing like that, I think, is neighborhood life. Immigrant neighborhood life is like that too. That, you know, the scene of the crowded immigrant street from the early 20th century has a kind of lasting, almost limitless appeal for Americans because of all the things it says about community, about a sense of purpose, about you know, a way of life that is at once unfamiliar and also attractive. And I think once I was in the mayor's office in Brockton, and I tripped over a photograph that was propped up against the desk, and it was a photograph of a celebration of one of Rocky Marciano's victories in downtown Brockton. And the mayor, I sort of tripped over and said, "Excuse me," and he stopped and he looked at it with me and he said, "Yeah, look, you know, all the men are wearing a hat, and all the women are dressed up in their, you know, in their Sunday best." And you know, there was a kind of the aura of that photograph just kind of washed over him, you know, and that also is an artifact of industrial urbanism, that sense of what the street is for and who's in it and what kind of life is in that street. Yeah. And I think that is deeply appealing, both for historical reasons and because it speaks to whatever is lacking or a sort of a felt lack in present life, where, you know, you're feeling particularly electronically isolated from the real world, and there, you know, there's these images of a different way of living. I mean, that's certainly a lot of my pleasure in it is, so, you know, you go to the museum and then you take the kids for a walk along the river or a kayak on the river and say, well, you know, so this was the power source. You know, this river was the power source for this industry, you know, those engines we saw in the museum. And so that your physical experience of the landscape is connected to the kind of intellectual template for that experience of the landscape, which you got at the museum, as you say, at the kiosk. If you think about the hook for the resale, you can think of it as a pejorative phrase and say, well, it's about, you know, sort of figuring out a way to market, to trick people into buying things, basically. But that's not what I understood the manager of the House of Blues who said that to me to be saying. What he was saying was that we can't build a business, in this case on blues, because the constituency for that business, which is industrial migrants from the American South, no longer exists in the numbers that would support it. So we use people's strong feeling for the blues, their curiosity about it, their desire to know more about it, and, crucially, their relationship to the music's derived from it. That is, their relationship to the layers of popular music that they actually inhabit, to get them interested in coming to this place and to get them curious about, you know, a sort of a immanent, a kind of understood history of music that you can hear in listening to any song, a pop song from now or from back then. And so he's saying the blues is sort of how they get people interested in all different kinds of genres. But he also meant that literally the business model of the House of Blues is that they don't make money on the music, they make money on food and on T-shirts, right, and stuff in the gift shop. And saying we get them in the door with music, and then right. So I'm interested in the relationship between those two things, between, you know, people's sort of genuine, passionate desire for a sort of a thicker, a more fully grounded sense of themselves in the world and the landscape they inhabit, and the fact that museums and blues clubs and all kinds of other business concerns need to turn a profit, and how those two things play out in relation to each other. I'm always interested in the relationship between business and art, right? And I think the hook for the resale is sort of a rich way to conceive it. I think that you know, what he was talking about could be seen as very cynical, but it could also be seen as a kind of how do we turn this often inchoate desire for more life, for more of a sense of oneself in the world, into, you know, a viable institution. There's people making the argument now about why the state should spend public money on culture and on the creative economy, and it's a moment when you know, there are going to be voices saying that's a luxury, that's an add-on, we can't afford that now, and sort of this is exactly the moment for the people making that argument to say, no, this is actually a very cost-effective way to spend your money on what these cities and towns are increasingly about. That is to say, the form and function of these cities is no longer to bring in raw materials, turn them into finished goods in factories, and get them back out again. It has much more to do not only with providing services, but with the flow of ideas and with people engaging with the city itself, with the history of the city. And so it's sort of a moment to say, well, no, actually, instead of regarding this as an add-on that needs to get cut, so we can say for basics, to say that these are dollars that get leveraged better than most other dollars that get spent by government, and that it's the time to really devote ourselves to spending this money. And that is one thing I'd also like to talk about, because that's a strong argument for treating culture not just as an enticement, but in that sense as the business of cities.